Howdy there, Isaac here. We'll once again be covering the story of Izuku Uchiha today. The last part left off on a pretty big cliffhanger, as well as having some pretty huge changes in general. The light goal for today's video will be 15, since the last two light goals got hit pretty fast. In the last part, we saw Izuku face off against the League of Villains, showing some promise with his Sharingan. He was able to beat a pretty sizable crowd of low-level villains, as well as cast a couple perfect illusions afterwards. Unfortunately, after All Might failed to defeat Nomu, Izuku was the one to fall against the monster. Nomu would end up breaking several bones in Izuku's chest and face, as well as also breaking his right arm. Before passing out, Izuku would see Small Might, and the sight of the hopeless number one hero would be etched into his mind, making him lose faith in the hero community. We continue our story now. All Might would fail to show up for the UA meeting and would end up calling in sick for the day. The number one hero had much to think about, including possibly ending his hero career and focusing on training his successor. But was he even a worthy trainer for the successor of One for All? Doubt flooded the mind of All Might. No, the mind of Toshinori. Yes, he wasn't All Might anymore. All Might would have been able to save his students, would have been able to fight off those villains. He would have been able to intervene in the torture of young Izuku Uchiha. Toshinori laid his head down in his hands, shame and regret filling his thoughts. And that was the state he would stay in during his time off. The media would cover the incident even more so than in canon, and the public would eat up a story about a UA student being hospitalized by a villain. The pressure on UA would be tenfold, with them having to hold a press conference on the matter. Aizawa would show up to the conference along with the principal and Snipe. The questions asked of the heroes would be harsh, with a few intended to piss off Aizawa or Snipe. Since Aizawa hasn't softened up as much as in canon, he'd end up getting more pissed than anything else. He wouldn't pop off or anything, but he wouldn't answer in a calm tone either. The press conference would end with not much closure for the public, but plenty of fuel for the journalists. The public would also begin to ask where All Might was, as well as asking what had happened to him. Soon, fear would begin to take root in the public eye, which the media would quickly take advantage of. The fear-mongering of the press, the disappearance of All Might, the appearance of villains who could attack again, it was all a recipe for disaster, for the roots of chaos to begin to take hold. All this would be seen by Izuku, who was stuck watching TV in a hospital bed. His injuries were too extensive for a recovery girl to heal in one go, and if she kissed him again, he'd end up dying. Izuku watched on as he saw the news spin their lies and thoughts about the situation in hero society. Even without Sharingan, he could tell that most people didn't understand how things went down at USJ. It wasn't the heroes' fault that the villains were stronger than them, and it wasn't All Might's fault that the villains brought something specifically designed to beat him. The heroes did their best, and they shouldn't be faulted for failing once. That was the proper thing to say, and yet there was another side of Izuku that wanted the hero community to pay, to own up to their failures, to admit that because the heroes were strong, it only made the villains want to be stronger. All it would take is one match to light the gasoline being poured on the floor. And this was the state that Izuku Uchiha would be in for the next few days. 3 days later, Izuku would be released from the hospital, though he still had a cast on his arm and bandages on his face. It was a shame that he couldn't train. Izuku knew that at USJ, the only reason the students lived was because of the teachers. The young Uchiha knew he was nowhere near Aizawa's level, let alone All Might's. He'd have to train harder than he had before, but he couldn't do that if he was injured. Upon arriving at school, Izuku would immediately visit the nurse's office to receive a kiss from Recovery Girl. He'd get the treatment and his injuries would be mostly fixed. His arm wasn't completely healed, but he could now bend it at the elbow, and his face was now completely pain-free. The young Uchiha would peel off his bandages, slowly revealing the damage done to the left side of his face. Recovery Girl would sigh, with Izuku taking in the sights silently. There had apparently been several lacerations to his face, most of them covering his cheeks or near his eye. Luckily for him, his eye was completely fine. There were many scars lining his eye and cheek, most of them being small, but there was a large one that started at his jaw and ended near his ear. Izuku had flashbacks to All Might, a hero whose staple was smiling. The young Uchiha tried smiling, but it quickly faded away. How could he smile in a situation like this? Not only was he nearly killed, but now he was left with scars to remind him of the event. Izuku was livid, but being angry wouldn't help anything. It wouldn't change the past. Izuku would take a deep breath, trying to calm himself down, only for the door to the nurse's office to swing open, revealing All Might. The two would stare at each other in disbelief. Of all the times to meet again, it had to be now? Izuku's frown quickly turned into a scowl. All Might, on the other hand, had a shocked expression at first, before having an apologetic look on his face. The number one hero looked at Izuku and, with a frown, would apologize. Young Uchiha, I am sincerely sorry. I failed to protect you as a hero and as your teacher. All Might wanted to add a but, or an and, but he couldn't find any way to offer anything better than just a regular apology. He had lost faith in himself, and his ability to be better, to see himself become stronger than he already was. Izuku stood there, a slight look of disgust on his face. He had loved All Might as a kid, but now he had no idea how he felt. Izuku simply wanted nothing more than to pretend like the hero didn't even exist. There's no need to apologize. You did your best, but the villains just got the jump on you. What happened, All Might. Let's just move forward. The coldness in Izuku's voice stung All Might, but he nodded and agreed. Izuku then left the office in order to attend class. Izuku would learn of the UA Sports Festival and recognize what it meant. If he won the tournament, he'd be able to learn from some of the strongest heroes. Over the next 2 weeks, Izuku would train his Sharingan. Within the first week, he was fully healed, giving him a full week to train his body, and train he did. The young Uchiha used every ounce of strength during his training sessions. From sunup to sundown, he'd work out, jogging on the beach, lifting weights, doing parkour in the forest, and using genjutsu. In only a week, he had trained himself to have his Sharingan active for a full 8 minutes. And then, the day of the sports festival came. Izuku would look around the stadium, looking at all of his friends and foes. He'd have to beat all of them, but wasn't sure if he could. With only 2 weeks of training, could he really end up beating someone like Bakugo or Todoroki? Well, there was only one way to find out, wasn't there? The overall mood for the sports festival was pretty mixed. Many were anxious over a possible second villain attack, while others were pumped to see the famous Class 1A students. As for the students themselves, well, they were also harboring mixed emotions regarding the festival. Some of them were still feeling demoralized from the attack and the subsequent disappearance of All Might, while others were pumped to show what they could do. The most conflicted of the students was Bakugo himself. The students would gather around, with Bakugo still giving the commencement speech. He would deliver it exactly as he did in the anime, though his thought process was far different. Part of him felt utterly useless and like he'd end up failing to beat Todoroki or Izuku, the only two who acted against Nomu. But Bakugo felt he had to win, like he had to keep trying to be the best. No, he had to prove to himself that he was the best, because if he didn't, then what was he? Useless. The word echoed in the back of his mind. It was always there now, mocking him. Once the obstacle course started, Bakugo would race forward without hesitation. Bakugo had something to prove here, being much more motivated than in the anime. He was both chasing his dreams, while also being chased by his monstrous fears. Due to this, I think he'd actually be even with Todoroki in the early stages before eventually passing him in the minefield portion of the race. And what about Izuku? Well, the young Uchiha would come in 20th place or so. Now, by no means is this because he's weak or anything. No, this was intentional. Izuku was thinking a bit more like the crafty 1B students, purposely staying behind and not showing off much of his quirk, if at all. He would still show off his amazing jumping and parkour abilities, but other than that, Izuku Uchiha would be a mystery. This, however, wouldn't make him invisible. He's no Harry Potter, but Izuku is a boy who lived against a villain who defeated All Might. The students would be watching him, along with Todoroki and Bakugo. Luckily for Izuku, as the race went on, most of the students would forget about him, due to the flashier people showing off. Okay, now for some interesting changes here. The cavalry battle would be much different from canon. Izuku would end up teaming with Ojiro before Shinso got to him, as well as teaming up with Shoji before Mineta could get to him. Now, Izuku would try to recruit Ida too, but like in the anime, Ida saw Izuku as a worthy rival, and considered himself better off with Todoroki. The last person to be recruited would be Tokoyami, since Izuku saw great use for his versatile quirk. Izuku wasn't gunning for first place, but he was simply trying to survive and maybe even capture a few points for himself. Now, while Bakugo and Todoroki battled for first, Izuku would skirt around the battlefield, occasionally picking off some of the small fry that couldn't penetrate Shoji and Tokoyami's defenses. This would lead to Izuku facing off against Monoma's group, and well, Monoma would have no chance of touching Izuku. The Uchiha would put Monoma under a genjutsu and easily take his points, while Shoji held off the other students. Turns out, dupli arms are really good for grappling. However, the cavalry battle between Bakugo and Todoroki would be much more intense. The two giants of Class 1A would duke it out, with Todoroki having the better defense, but Bakugo having far more mobility. This battle would be the main focus of these two teams, with most of the others not being able to even get near them. In the end, Bakugo and Todoroki's battle would end in a stalemate, so the final rankings would be just about the same as in canon. One of Shinso's teammates would quit, but his new teammate, named Rin, would not. This would allow Tetsu Tetsu to fight in the tournament, but we do have a few changes for who fights which battles. Unlike in the anime, Izuku wouldn't talk with Todoroki, who never used his flames, nor would Izuku learn as much about Shinso. However, I think the two would have a pretty interesting battle. Todoroki would notice that he'd most likely end up fighting Izuku in his second match. A part of Todoroki did still feel bad for Izuku. Felt like Izuku was a better hero than him, one who selflessly threw himself at Nomu to save him. How could Todoroki face the person who saved him? For now, he'd just have to watch on and prepare for his own fight. Izuku would walk onto the tournament ring, ready to take out Shinso. The first match would begin with Shinso taunting Izuku. "The boy who lived, huh? How's it feel to get crushed by a villain?" This would really make Izuku's blood boil, so much so that he would instantly activate his Sharingan. He didn't want to use them yet, but at this point he just wanted to crush Shinso. Izuku would begin to run towards his opponent, making a bead of sweat appear on his brow. "You're lucky. You're fast and have a good quirk. Because of my quirk, I've always been at a disadvantage. You'd never understand. You were blessed with a strong quirk." Izuku would quickly catch up to Shinso, grabbing the student by the arms and kneeing him in the stomach. Shinso would double over in pain, coughing up bile, though Izuku didn't know if it was from the pain or from his knee shoving the contents up, though luckily it missed his thigh. You've no idea the work I've had to put in to become this strong. I don't want to hear your whining. Shinso was in so much pain that he had stopped trying to use his quirk. Izuku was looking down at him, which pissed him off. Shinso would attempt to punch Izuku for this, but the Uchiha would easily block the attack and counter with a punch of his own. Shinso would be sent flying back, barely in the ring by now. Shinso would stand up and start yelling frantically at Izuku, trying desperately to make him talk. Izuku responded, telling Shinso to shut up. This would surprise Shinso. How? How was it that his mind control powers were being countered? Izuku stared forward at Shinso, looking him directly in the eyes. Somehow it was like Izuku was immune to Shinso's quirk, but Shinso also had an immunity. Turns out, Izuku couldn't put him under a genjutsu. It was like, for some reason, their quirks canceled each other out. This was a very interesting coincidence, but just to be safe, Izuku would make sure to keep eye contact with Shinso at all times. While Izuku wanted to find out if there was anything more to this, he knew he had to finish off Shinso quickly. And so, in only seconds, Izuku would run up to the student and kick the poor boy out of the ring. And like that, the battle of the two villainous students concluded. Before the two left the ring, Izuku would tell Shinso something. Once you learn to fight better, and stop whining so much, we should have a rematch. This would actually shock Shinso a bit. Why would he want to have a rematch? Why was this person being all chummy with him all of a sudden? Shinso would simply grunt and walk away, though he would get a confidence boost from the crowd. Some heroes would say he had a great quirk, with his fellow students saying he put up a good fight. This, along with Izuku saying he should put in more work, would light a fire under Shinso. Meanwhile, Izuku would go back to his waiting room, sitting down and thinking about how he'd beat Todoroki. Are you guys ready for a brief lightning round of the preliminary matches? Alright, Todoroki versus Tape Dude. Todoroki wins like in canon. Kaminari would be facing off against Aoyama, and I'm pretty sure Kaminari takes it. Aoyama wouldn't risk killing Kaminari, and the latter would have no problems executing the former. So, Kaminari moves on to the next round. Ito would be facing Ojiro, and I think Ito would take it. Low to medium difficulty. Sure, Ojiro is strong and smart, but Ida is just too fast and powerful. So, Ida moves on to the next round. Mina versus Rin from Class 2A. Well, if you don't know about this character, basically he can grow scales and shoot them out. He's a pretty good fighter, and while Mina isn't too shabby, she definitely isn't that strong of a fighter. I think Rin would take this one, though with a good degree of difficulty. Rin moves on to the next round. Momo versus Tokoyami would go just like in canon, though Momo would put up more of a fight since she has been training to be better ever since she gave up her presidency to Ida. Tokoyami moves on to the next round. Kirishima versus Tetsu would go the same, with Kirishima eventually winning. And finally, Bakugo versus Shoji. Yeah, I like Shoji, but there's no way he's winning here. Bakugo wins against Shoji. Bakugo moves on to the next round. And now, we get to the next set of matches. The first match, Izuku versus Todoroki. The two would step into the ring, both having a great deal of respect for each other. Todoroki looked at Izuku, noticing the various scars lining his face. If he had been faster, would Izuku have had those scars? If he had used his flames, would it have... No. Todoroki vowed he would never use his father's flames. The young hero would look towards Izuku. He wanted to say sorry, but it just wouldn't come out. Izuku activated his Sharingan once the bell rang, but even without them, he could see the pain in Todoroki's eyes. The two were very alike, probably in more ways than one. Izuku raced forward so fast that Todoroki couldn't even put up an ice wall. Izuku easily kicked Todoroki back, though by this point an ice wall had been erected. However, Izuku was expecting this. Jumping into the air, the young Uchiha avoided the ice and even jumped off of it, flying straight towards Todoroki, using a move eerily similar to All Might's. Izuku would land a brutal punch to Todoroki before quickly dodging another ice attack, only to repeat the process over and over again. Todoroki was no slouch though. He would slowly begin to dodge Izuku's attacks, before outright blocking one. The young hero had grabbed Izuku's leg, beginning to freeze it over. The Uchiha smiled before kicking his opponent in the face with his other leg. Todoroki let go of Izuku, who fell to the ground but quickly recovered. Izuku jumped forward with his free leg, using his frozen one to land a devastating side kick on Todoroki. The kick was so powerful that the ice on Izuku's leg shattered. Todoroki was in sensory overload. How? It was like Izuku had, in the midst of battle, gotten several times faster. Or was he only holding back? Was this Izuku's payback for what had happened at USJ? Todoroki looked at Izuku, but instead of a student, he saw a demon staring back at him. Todoroki felt nothing but pure dread, as if this demon had no other purpose than to end his own life. Just as Izuku was going to land the finishing blow, fire would sprout out from Shoto's arm and leg, burning Izuku and causing him to retreat. So, Todoroki was hiding something after all, huh? Good. Now Izuku could beat him at his best, in front of not only everyone in the stadium, but most importantly, the number 2 hero, Endeavor. But that, fam, is where we'll be leaving it off for now. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to leave a like, and maybe even subscribe. Until next time, bye bye!